for the purpose of presenting the partial draft as to where we are at this point in terms of updating the zoning. The main areas that we've focused on up to this point are essentially residential districts and the maps. And Brandy Saxton, our consultant who's here, is going to go into it in a lot more detail than I'm able to articulate anyway. And I think you'll see that there aren't a lot of dramatic extreme changes by any means, but we're just trying to update, bring the bylaws into conformity with the most current state requirements, and update the maps to some degree to reflect the reality of existing development patterns in the city, update the maps to reflect new requirements for shoreline areas. And we have the whole planning commission here tonight, and just going around, we have Dennis Chenette, Carol O'Connell, Gina Sorelli, Kevin Mead, and Frank Cheney, the zoning administrator, is here. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brandy.
Great. Thank you.
Oh, and I should have mentioned that there are going to be 2 breaks during her presentation for Q&A that are built into it.
Yeah. So I'm going to walk through a few introductory slides and then start in the downtown and waterfront areas, and then we'll break and have opportunity for questions there, and then talk about the residential zoning districts, and break and talk about those again with questions. So just to follow up on what John said, why is the city of Newport undertaking a revision to the regulations now? The real reasons are that it's time to take a look again. As he said, the city has adopted a new plan, has the waterfront and downtown master plan done a few years ago, which had some very specific recommendations for the regulations and for the overall desired improvements in downtown and the waterfront. Those were sort of incorporated into this most recent city plan. The regulations that the city has have to implement the municipal plan, and so we are definitely looking at that to bring pieces into greater conformance with those planning documents. And then Vermont statute is the other guiding, directing force for this revision. Under Vermont law, municipalities have to regulate in accordance with statute, and there's been a fair amount of activity in Montpelier, particularly around housing. And we'll be talking, when we get to that residential portion, about some of the changes that are going to be needed to meet those new statutory requirements. And then, as we always do when we look at regulations, we're always trying to make them more clear, easier to use, easier to understand, so we're working on those pieces as well. So the main focus of what we're here to talk to tonight is the zoning districts and the map. This is a big piece of the project that the Planning Commission has been working on for some months. And I just wanted to bring this quote from the waterfront and downtown master plan up. So it says, to better facilitate growth, formulate revisions to the existing code that provide flexible requirements with clear objectives that will attract new tenants and businesses and will facilitate beautifying building edges along the waterfront and Route 5. And that is really a core recommendation that we have been working with, and we'll see how that plays out in these regulations. So we are looking at the zoning map in its entirety and have looked at the entire city. So what you're seeing up here on the screen, and a little later I will show you how to access these maps and actually get them up on your own screens and look at them in greater detail. This is the city's current zoning map She's also back there on the back wall. And we have looked at that and are recoloring and reshaping and creating new zoning districts or amended zoning district boundaries. What John said is true. This is sort of a refining the edges and adjusting. It's not a dramatically different vision for future land use and development, just calibrating things to better align with the vision and the existing development pattern. So we're going to start with the downtown districts. Here what we are looking at in terms of why are we looking at the downtown districts, and I think I'm going to stop here for just one moment before I jump down there. The downtown and waterfront master plan obviously focused in this area and had, as I said, a series of specific recommendations. There's also been significant change affecting the downtown and waterfront since the community last looked at your regulations, in depth, which would have been around 2010. You've obviously had the demolition of a block. There has been the increase of, with a public pocket park and landscaping and the new bike paths. So there's been increased amenity and connections made between the Main Street and the waterfront. So a lot has happened in those intervening 13 years or so. And so we're really coming back and looking at that plan that's set forth and the direction that's set forth in the regulations and making adjustments as needed. So I'm going to walk you through the zoning districts. If you didn't pick up handouts at the back table, there are two. The bigger one is the downtown zoning districts, and the individual districts are all laid out in some level of detail, and there's a map that is the same, basically, as that map. There's also information about how to get to the website where there's more detailed mapping and things like that. So we're going to start in the core area here in the center of downtown, the central business district, the downtown business district. This is, when you go look at the printed maps, sort of a dark red, brick red kind of color. And so the point here is to do what your planning documents say. Foster a walkable and vibrant center that attracts visitors, supports local businesses, has high-quality streetscaping and urban design, and supports the vision for redeveloping the vacant block to take advantage of its location and the potential for lake views and sort of being in the center of downtown. And what we're really looking at in the downtown business district is both that one thing, which is a major change, a new building or more than one building, and the ongoing process of small incremental change to existing buildings. And we need regulations that are going to work for both of those things. So as we carry on with the map, going out from the core of the central business district, there are two mixed-use areas, and those are the orange areas on the map. Those areas, they're intended to wrap around and sort of the areas that are more intensively developed, but they're not sort of the block form commercial parts of your downtown. They have a mix of businesses and residential buildings in them. And the idea is to maintain that going forward. So there's two areas. There's the area around off of Main Street and the School Street intersection area and 3rd Street. And then there's another area that's off of and around 2nd Street. So those two mixed use zones. And then stepping out further, we get to the brown areas, and that's the downtown residential district areas that are being looked at. These are primarily residential blocks now, and the idea would be that they would remain primarily residential blocks. There's 4 of these areas. There's an area around Eastern Ave and 2nd Street. There's one on Summer, I'll keep moving these forward, Summer and 3rd Street. There is one on Bayview and School Street, and one over on Seymour Lane and Field Ave. So these are the downtown residential areas. And one thing I didn't mention, which is important to know here about these zoning districts, is that these zoning districts fall within the city's designated downtown, which is a program that helps support redevelopment and investment in the downtown area. So the full area of the downtown business district, those mixed-use districts, and the residential districts are in that designated downtown area, which is one of the reasons the line is drawn the way it is, to break where the rest of the residential areas sort of like continue on, maybe along Prospect Street or Pleasant Street and Main Street. That edge is essentially the edge of the designated downtown, and that's a state program. So then we move on to the waterfront, and this is all of the big blue area on the map. This is an area where there has been a little bit of change from the current zoning, a bit more of a change, and sort of looking at what areas to consider part of what you might call the urban waterfront or the developed waterfront, places where you would want to promote more activity for people that would attract people, recreational activities, dining, maybe lodging even, things like we see out here, all the boating activity. And really work on, as is recommended in the plans, orienting the development down here on the waterfront to the water. We're really trying to emphasize that, probably a little bit more than the current regulations do, so that's one of the changes, the little recalibration pieces in the regulations. And then we also have looked at the extents of that, and really with an eye towards thinking about this waterfront, not here from the land, but as you look at it from the water and looking into the city. This, and you can see it out the window here, it's very helpful to be right here. It is a bay, and this whole waterfront is a very much of one piece. And so we are looking at extending out that waterfront area to go up to Prouty Beach and to go out to Ference Point, so that we're basically capturing that whole area that, as you come in towards the city, really reads together and looks together as being Newport when you're looking at it from the water. To the piece that goes out towards Prouty Beach, you've obviously now gotten a bike path that links from here all the way out through there, really creating new opportunities and new use and development opportunities that could come along that could benefit from that connection. This is where, just like the existing regulations envision some sort of long-term redevelopment of the waterfront plaza to be more oriented to the water, we would continue with that, a slightly different approach, but really still the same principle, that ultimately over time, if that property were to be changed, how to really improve and expand and take advantage of the asset that the water is here. And then going out towards Ference Point, the connections, it doesn't exist now, that exists as it goes out to Prouty Beach and beyond, but thinking about how to link the rest of this portion of the developed waterfront in to the downtown. So really expanding this blue area on the map. Now, not all of this blue zone is in the designated downtown. The part here is obviously, but it only goes up to essentially the east side, and it doesn't go out basically much beyond this property in this direction. So that is an expansion in the zoning. It is not an expansion of the designated downtown at this point, but it is a place where this set of zoning districts goes beyond the designated area. And then there's one more downtown zoning district, and that's the bright pink area here. And that's a downtown industry district, and that's really reflecting the working waterfront and rail heritage of the community and the anchor businesses that are still there, to try to make sure that the regulation works to allow the ongoing operation of those businesses and to facilitate their needs into the future. So that's a quick tour of the map for the downtown area. Those are the proposed downtown districts. If you have your handout, you have this table in there, which sort of summarizes what's going on in each of those districts. We're going back in a way to something that's still got the form-based code elements that the city adopted in 2010, but pulls back in some of the more conventional zoning pieces that were removed when the form-based code was adopted. So there's some basic standards in these districts for lots, like lot size and frontage and coverage. That's how much you can cover the lot with buildings and parking and other hard surfaces like that. And it also puts a cap on residential density back to the mixed use and the residential districts where there isn't one right now under the form-based code. So it pulls back a few of those basic standards from earlier approaches to zoning there. And the reason for doing that is that the form-based code is really good for regulating new construction, but almost everything that's happening in downtown Newport and has since the form-based code was adopted has been incremental change to existing buildings or changes of use inside existing buildings. And in those situations, the form-based code has been more challenging and not necessarily the best tool to deal with that kind of incremental change. And so we want to both address that piece, the small changes over time to the existing buildings and existing uses, as well as the new construction piece that the form-based code does so well. So, like we said, we're going to retain many of the form-based code principles. These are some basic good design elements, right? Like breaking up the mass of a big building if one is going to be built, so that it fits in with the buildings that are already here, doesn't overwhelm them. This is something that the current regulations do. As buildings get taller, the upper floors need to be set back. That helps, so as you're on the street and you're looking at the buildings, they don't read like they're really tall and closing you in while you're down on the street. That's a very common way to make sure that taller buildings can be fit into an older downtown setting where historically the tallest buildings were more like 4 stories. So you can get 5 or 6 stories without it really looking any different from the street, or not significantly different from the street.
Could you speak just a little louder?
Yep, I will do that. Sorry.
Thank you.
And then the last one is to make sure that there are transitions. So as we said, that downtown business district is sort of a commercial block building style. Taller buildings, usually 3, 4, maybe more stories. And they meet up with what are really more residential scale buildings, 2 or 3 story buildings typically, often gable roofed buildings instead of flat roofed buildings. And so we want to make sure that there's a smooth transition between those at those meetup points. One way to do that is if a new larger building was going to be built, you just step it down in height a little bit as it approached a residential neighbor, to just make that a little more gentle transition between the districts. And so this leads to, these are all some of the basic design elements in the current form-based code. The current form-based code extends outside the designated downtown. This is a little bit hard to see, but this dark area here is the designated downtown, just as a point of reference. And then the orange area that's hatched over it is the current form-based code set of districts. And so there are 6 form-based code districts. The city certainly wants to keep the form-based code in the downtown area. It's actually part of what makes the city eligible for its downtown designation. And the form-based code, one thing to know about it, if you're not familiar with it, is that it does a different thing than conventional zoning, is it really focuses on regulating the building, with the assumption that if you regulate the shape and form and height and type of building, you are effectively regulating what's likely to happen inside the building. Because certain things only happen in certain types of buildings. And so most of the controls over use and other things that are done in conventional zoning are let go. And so that's where we're going back to a more of a hybrid approach, and also looking at this area. You know, I think when this was originally drawn back in 2010, the notion was that these were areas that the city wanted revitalized. They wanted redeveloped. Now we're thinking of trying to pull this focus point in a little bit closer to the downtown and the waterfront. So if we slide the map over, you can see that difference of contracting that inward, but then also bringing it to the waterfront. So it's something of a contraction and a reshape. Carry on here. So the form-based code areas would be taken away from East Main Street, the blocks around Prospect Street, and from the Bogner property area where they currently are within that form-based code area. And then we would extend, because we've extended the waterfront, the downtown waterfront area, extend that out. It would cover Broadview Avenue to Prouty Beach. It would take in Gardner Park, and because the downtown industry area is part of the designated downtown, it was never put into the form-based code in the first instance, but because we want the whole designated downtown in, we would put it there with some recognition that the design standards are not going to apply the same way in the industrial district. Clearly industrial buildings have different needs, and we will address that. So you can see the proposed reworking of the form-based code. There's a large map of the form-based code overlay area in the back. It's, as I said, it is a hybrid, so there's still going to be uses that are going to be allowed. There are some dimensional standards that are underlying. And the form-based code would come in and apply when there was going to be new construction. And it applies mostly at what's going on around the edge of the blocks, rather than in the middle of blocks. So it really focuses on how development's going to relate to the street. Where's a new building going to be placed on the lot? And when you go look at that map, some of the blocks have a red line that indicate the area to which a building would need to be built to, or would need to be covered. You know, that red line would need to be covered by a building. It indicates where parking can go on the lot. So we don't want parking close to Main Street. We want that tucked back behind buildings. We don't want parking right up on the waterfront. We want to use the waterfront for other more beneficial purposes. So you'll see a purple line indicating the portions of the blocks where parking can go. And then there's a designation for some waterfront use areas. So these are the places that we want to promote and sort of reserve to as much as possible for the water-oriented uses. So whether that's direct things like boating, or it's waterfront restaurants, or other ways that the community benefits from having development that relates to the water. And so you can see those areas with the blue dots on the map. And then we are thinking about some areas where we want to prioritize linkages. So the downtown and waterfront master plan really spent a good deal of time thinking about the linkages between downtown and the water and how to strengthen those. And that's both physically being able to move yourself from point A to point B, and also just being able to view. So where can you view the water from? And if you're out here on the water, what can you see back into? So that you are encouraging people to go in both directions. Okay, and that is actually the end of the downtown districts. I'm just looking, and I think I've hit most of the points I wrote down, so that's good. So are there any questions that folks want to put out on the downtown districts before we talk about the residential districts?
Yeah, I have
Yes.
one. The area that you have that's in the pink, which you're calling downtown industry, Coventry Street, when I look here, it says housing not allowed, lodging not allowed. Well, currently, that's significant housing on Coventry Street.
There is a small amount of housing remaining back there, so there is some existing housing. The idea would be to not facilitate more of it, but to leave those areas as expansion room for the business activities that are there. There has been some acquisition and expansion around the pick and shovel site. So there's been some buildings, I think, actually taken down even in there.
There's still several buildings that are housing.
Yes,
Sounds pretty crappy, but other is in good condition.
Yes, there are a few existing homes in there. And that pink line, just in case you're wondering where it actually falls in relation to the pick and shovel. So the actual building is in the downtown business district, the red, and so that is sort of in the parking lot portion just outside the building where that line comes through. If you sort of think about, there's a parking, you can kind of drive through on a kind of parking aisle just outside the building, and that's basically where that line is.
But you are going to leave the housing that's there intact.
Yes, though zoning doesn't work backwards, so we can't use it to go force things that exist to go away. It's just a question of what do you want in the future? Do you want more of?
Sure.
Yep.
I just had two questions. One of them you may be answering in the future, and one of them you sort of answered. What do you do about a grandfather clause? You want something to be different in that area, and yet a lot of usage winds up being continued because of grandfather clauses. What do you do with that?
Well, that is how zoning works. What exists can continue to operate as it is, assuming that it's lawful and reasonably it's been operated the same way. You can't typically change how it's operated very much. There might be there's usually some limited scope for expansion or modification, but it's fairly limited. Many things that are grandfathered continue on for decades. It does pose potentially some challenges for transferring businesses sometimes, and things like that, but certainly for sort of in-family ownership of property and businesses, it typically doesn't pose a difficulty.
And the second thing was you sort of wiped out the use in the East Main Street area. You said you were going to get rid of form-based code, and I just wanted to know what replaces it when you don't have it anymore.
Yes,
I
so.
knew maybe going to cover that, I don't know.
Actually, it's a good question, and we really weren't going to speak to that very much tonight, but it would go to a general business commercial district right along East Main Street, which is that bright red on the map back there. So if you go back, there isn't a handout for that one at this point, but that's those bright red zones on the map.
Right.
And then there are residential blocks, once you get back off of East Main Street.
And what does that do? How is that different from, how is the business, general business, different from form-based code?
Well, it's actually going to take those areas back to probably much more similar zoning to what they had in 2009. So it's very much a sort of a return to the more conventional commercial type of zoning that was there. There will still be standards, to ensure the streetscaping and, where's parking going to go and landscaping and things like that if there's going to be new developments in that area. But those businesses should actually find themselves sitting a little bit more comfortably with the regulations, I think, than they do under the current form-based code, because right now many of them are not conforming with the code. They long predate it. They run into some challenges, with the sort of built-in design standards and considerations about what can happen along the street in some locations. So.
And does that pose a threat in any way to the residences that might be behind the businesses in that area? I mean, can the businesses be more noisy, give off more fumes?
No, I actually think that in many ways the conventional zoning will provide the city with more tools to address the impacts on the neighboring blocks than the form-based code does. The form-based code doesn't provide that many tools for doing that in the first instance. So I think returning those areas back, and similarly the same sort of thought around the Bogner property as well, returning those back to a more conventional zoning makes sense in both of those instances for those business sites.
Thank you.
One question, what does the green represent on that?
Yes, the linkage corridors that I was speaking of.
Okay.
That's sort of thinking about where are the major corridors or where they may be in the future. The current form-based code sort of has a street grid that it imposes over the form-based code area, some of which exists and some of which doesn't. This is a bit of a replacement for that concept by still trying to identify some key corridors. We're still kind of thinking of, particularly once you go over the causeway and are heading up through the waterfront plaza, exactly how to best arrange and orient those. But for right now, the basic concept is to think about sort of the through corridors that might come through and connect the water and sort of the main travel way at the main street or on Route 5.
I think what might be helpful, Brandy, is if you go a little further into, one of the things that she's trying to do is to preserve what we see. So that what we see when we come into the city and these beautiful sort of vistas, and is to preserve that with visual corridors. And it's actually, when you start going around, I went around and looked, I didn't think much of it at first, but after you go around and look, you can see that we, having been here all my life, you take it for granted, but when you start looking at what other people will see, if you start putting a building here and here and here, I think, Brandy, it might be beneficial for people to understand the whole idea of protecting the waterfront for public use, public viewing, and how these linkage corridors and visual corridors are designed to facilitate that. I think that might answer her question better.
Yes.
It was just they don't join, so I was wondering.
Yeah, if you're driving through the city and you're looking at these wonderful views and you start building in those views,
Yeah.
she actually, it's quite interesting what she's done with this if you take the time to go around the room.
Yeah, so,
Need longer
You know,
glasses.
yeah, right now, this is open, right? The building sits right here, and you kind of come into this intersection, you can see across, and there's, that nice gazebo type structure here is a real focal point. So this one exists, it is a
Yeah.
real success. And so that one, is both functions that you can walk through it, or bike through it, or drive through it. But you can also just see it, right? Whether you're here and you're looking back up into downtown, or you're downtown and you're like, the water is there, let's go explore it. So really the waterfront plan, the downtown plan, was really thinking about how to use the asset that is the lake to help revitalize the downtown, where you have the businesses on Main Street that need more traffic, more customer traffic, to be successful. And so both bringing people in for recreational activities, or bring them in from the water, because they're out on the water in the first instance, and then they come and enjoy Main Street, also for the people who live in the city and in the surrounding regions to be able to come and recreate and do downtown business as well. So really just strengthening that. And then, this corridor exists from 3rd Street to School Street, but obviously you can't physically get from the end of School Street to the water. And right now the visual isn't that good either. If you took down a few trees, you probably would have more view. But right now there is pretty heavy vegetation right here at the end of School Street. But sort of thinking about these crossway avenues, and could possibly replicate that concept on the waterfront plaza side as well. Although there are also some physical impediments there to trying to set those up. But that's the basic concept, is to really encourage the movement back and forth, and the link, that strong link and connection between an active waterfront, which does have a lot of, isn't privatized, it's places that people can go. They may be going to businesses that are oriented to the waterfront, but it's a space where you can come out here, you can walk, you can get into the water in places, or you can fish. There are opportunities to enjoy the water. You don't have to own a piece of the water to get to the water, and that's really an aspect that is the economic driver asset that the waterfront plan was identifying for the city. Anything else here? Okay, I'm going to move to the residential districts, which is the other focal point for tonight. So, I'm going to give you a little sneak peek. So if you got the handouts, this is the smaller one, is the residential districts. So right now in the city, we'll zoom this over to here. There are effectively two residential zoning districts. There is an urban residential district, which is the brighter green, which is hard to see on the screen, but if you go look at the maps, you can definitely see that. And then there's a general residential district, which actually, if you look at the map on the back wall, it's fairly obvious. The general residential, I think, is white.
Yes.
It's white. And the urban residential is the bright yellow. So you can sort of get an immediate sense there that you've got these two residential zoning districts. And these zoning districts have probably existed pretty much in their current form as long as the city has had zoning, I would suspect. We may have made some adjustments in a couple of places, but I would suspect that when you first wrote the zoning and adopted it, it had an urban residential district and a general residential district. So actually, I didn't want to do that. Let me come back here. So what we are looking to do here, if I can get my screen back under control. I don't know what just happened there. Try this again here. bumped something that made it grumpy, I think is the answer. Okay, so, why we are not on the screen, but anyway, so we are proposing to go from 2 to 4 residential zoning districts. So if you're looking at the map that's on the back of your handout, you can see those 4. So that same bright yellow is the residential 10, fairly equivalent to that urban residential district today, and then the rest is split up, so there's a residential 5, and then a residential 3, and a residential shoreline area, which is blue, pale blue. And so the idea behind these 4 districts is to allow a little bit more differentiation between the types of residential neighborhoods and densities and housing that might go in different parts of the city. And then, as John alluded to in his introduction, ensure that there's a district that deals with the shoreline, because shoreline residences have their own set of sort of needs and concerns that are good to address separately. And then, as I mentioned, starting out, that the legislature in Vermont has been very active in addressing housing needs across the state. There's a widespread recognition that there is a crisis in housing supply and affordability throughout the state. And they have enacted a new set of regulations and statutes intended to promote housing creation, really, particularly in serviced areas. And by serviced, we mean places with water and sewer, which a good portion of the city of Newport has. So a lot of what's in what is called the Homes Act will apply to you here. And so some of those requirements are that you need to allow higher densities, so at least 5 dwelling units per acre where there's sewer service. Anywhere across the entire state, someone who's got a lot with a single unit home on it can turn it into a 2-unit, a duplex, or anywhere that you could build a 1-unit house, you'll be able to build a duplex instead. So that's just going to be everywhere. And then other things that are related to being on sewer is that you're going to have to allow for small multi-unit dwellings, so 3- and 4-unit buildings, more like you allow for 1s and 2s now, so a lower level of review typically. And there's some additional language around what types of conditions and criteria the Development Review Board can use to review those applications for those smaller multi-unit buildings and also for affordable housing. So there's some changes there. There's some changes around parking, so you're only going to be able to require 1 parking space per dwelling unit rather than 2, which is common in many places. Parking often ends up being a fairly significant barrier to putting in housing because there just simply isn't enough space on a lot for the parking spaces. The question of where the cars are going to go remains somewhat unanswered by statute here, but you're only going to be able to require the 1 space. And then there is an automatic bonus that will be available to someone who is building affordable housing. And that's a density bonus, so more units, up to 40% more, or an additional story in building height. And that will be anywhere where it's going to be, where there's sewer service. So those are new pieces of statute that are rolling in. They'll start coming into effect as early as this summer and come in chunks, various pieces at different times throughout the rest of this year and next year. So we're definitely working to bring Newport's regulations in line with the new statute. That's one piece.
Could you just give us a clue as to what 4,000 square feet means in terms of acreage? I mean, most of us are used to...
Yes. So an acre is 43,560. So 4,000 is a little bit under a tenth of an acre.
Or another way to look at it is in terms of the 5 unit per acre standard. The neighborhood, the block that Melissa lives on the corner of, is all laid out in 75 by 100 lots, which is 6 lots per acre. 6 lots per acre is the existing practical layout of the entire block where Melissa lives. Just to give you a sense, that whole neighborhood was laid out in 75 by 100 lots in the 1950s.
But like 16,000 square feet, how many acres would that be?
That's about a third of an acre.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. 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 So these are running. So the numbers, if you think about it the other way, so the R10 at 4,000 square feet is essentially 10 4,000 square foot lots to the acre, roughly in this map. And the same, the R5. You get 5 8,000 square foot lots. At 16, you get about 3 16,000 square foot lots. So, and these are not wildly different than the densities, as John pointed out, that you would find, and the lot sizes that you would find in neighborhoods around Newport. You definitely have older neighborhoods, particularly closer into downtown and around East Main Street as well, that are going to be built on pretty small lots. You know, finding 4,000 to 6,000 square foot lots, they're definitely out there, maybe even some smaller. And then seeing that go up to you know, things that are going to be more like 10,000 to that 16,000 square foot range. Sort of as we go out from the center and out in time, as different eras of development occurred in parts of the city. You know, is also probably somewhat responsive to how you extended out the city's water and sewer system over time. You know, at a third of an acre lot, that often worked if it had water or sewer but didn't have both. Then a third of an acre lot was still a practical lot size, so you see things around that size quite commonly, somewhere between a third and a half, so that 16 to 20,000 square foot range. So we are trying to look, and we did do an analysis at the very beginning of this project to look at the various neighborhoods and blocks all around the city and get a pretty good understanding of what the typical dimensional requirements and what the typical dimensional standards are in those built places, because we want there to be opportunity for more housing in the neighborhoods, yes, but not necessarily a complete change in the built form of those neighborhoods, right? We don't want buildings that are dramatically different than what's there. Some room for maybe infill or some additional different types of housing, yes, but in the same sort of general scale and form, not wildly different. So that's the effort, is to try to, and then one of the reasons for having more districts, right, than just 2, so you could calibrate that a little more across those different neighborhoods.
I mean, another illustration of lot size is that the older parts of Sloane Street, Blake Street, that neighborhood was laid out beginning in the late 60s and into the 70s, and those are all 100 by 100, 10,000 square foot lots, so just over 4 per acre, just to give you
that was
practical
the era,
concept.
The era of the 100 by 100 foot lots.
Yeah.
Things, believe it or not, there are fads in subdivision, and so we can almost date them by knowing what size the lots are. But indeed, that there's a lot of sections. If you went out and looked, you would find those very basic repeats of very, very similar dimensional requirements.
Yeah. And then if you want to see really small lots, a lot of the little streets off West Main are good examples of that.
So what are the proposed changes? So there is a fair amount going on in these residential districts. As I went over, there's going to be more allowance for multi-unit housing. The scale of the multi-unit housing will vary based on what district it is, and that's when you're seeing the description under each of these districts in the table. There's, the R10 says all types of housing, but the R5 says, not more than 9 units in a building. So that would, that indicates there's a limitation on the sort of scale and size. When you get down to the R3, you're saying not more than 4 units in a building. So it is different types of housing and different scales of building in different areas of the city. And let me come forward here. No, that was the last of those residential slides. So, questions on the residential piece?
We don't have a lot of, from what I understand, we don't have a lot of property to develop, just nothing on it right now to develop. So will a lot of this affect neighborhoods that it's either going to be turning your house into a duplex or splitting up your lot to build another house on it? That sort of thing?
So there's a few pieces of larger pieces left, but you're right, there's not a massive amount of open, undeveloped land. So if Newport is to add more housing, certainly that small incremental additions within the fabric of existing neighborhoods is going to be a significant contribution to doing that, or at least a meaningful, maybe not significant, meaningful contribution to doing that. It will be slow because it requires essentially, for the most part, existing homeowners to want to make a change to their property. So it may happen when properties change hands, or as the needs of a household change over time, the composition of a household changes over time. I don't think that when this duplex provision comes into effect, which is theoretically July 1st, I think still, of this year, that there's going to be a sudden run to zoning administrators' offices across the state to get permits to turn, everyone wants to turn their house into a duplex. I don't think the demand is really there, but, over time, could more of these houses get split? Certainly. I mean, in the neighborhoods around downtown, you certainly see a lot of older homes that have been split into multi-unit buildings, some very successfully, others maybe less successfully in terms of the building character and the capacity on the lot to sort of have that many people on them. We think about those big old homes and how many people probably lived in them 100 years ago versus how many people are in a household today. There's a lot of homes here in the city with one or two people living in them. And that's also pretty common across the state in most communities. So thinking into the future, yes, the idea is there would be more opportunity to do different types of housing, not just detached, single unit, owner-occupied homes, particularly in those places that have the infrastructure to make that more viable.
Well, we've already seen some examples of infill. There's a little, one of the lots off Veterans Avenue near the high school had a lot of land behind it. And the owner of that divided it some years ago, and there are now two lots behind. There's a little side street or lane there that goes in, and there are a couple of houses tucked away behind the one that's near the road, as an example. Another infill example is that there are 2 lots on your block, the 2 houses that face Sias Avenue across Coburn Street from you. The way the backyards are laid out on those lots, there's a 75 by 100 foot lot on each that's never been developed with anything other than grass and a garden.
Ours is that way too.
And yours is actually that way too, now that I think of it, although I think of the garage as being further back. But in any event, those are possibilities should a homeowner decide down the road that if they want to sell their backyard to someone to do that.
So to go a little further, the density and dimensional changes are significant. And when you look into the future, when you talk about what Act 250 is doing and how much more difficult every year it's getting to build and expensive to build outside of a situation where you have services, these changes will provide an awful lot of land that is going to be able to be developed. When I look at people coming to me wanting to do things, lots of times it's the setbacks or the road frontage, the 100-foot requirement on the road frontage, and that is in the way. And by allowing a backlot and by allowing a simple change, if we decide to do it where you have 2 primary structures allowed on one lot, those things will increase the opportunity. I get an awful lot of requests for creative housing solutions for families that are having a difficult time buying a lot and spending $300,000 to build a 1,200 square foot ranch. Whether or not it will occur, I'm not sure, but I think this will open up the opportunity. You end up with a much more dense built-in environment. And if you talk to people from Chicago or from some of the bigger areas, you go up and you use more of the lot, and that allows for more people to live in a smaller space. It's an interesting concept, and one I think, we don't have a lot of people here tonight, but I think the citizens of Newport probably need to take a look at, because we need housing, and not just a certain type of housing, but housing across all spectrums of the economic sector. But how dense do we want it?
Yeah.
So tell your friends, Melissa.
And the state has certainly, with the new Homes Act, prescribed some requirements that we have no choice but to meet at this point.
Well, I mean, the state wants us all to live on top of each other in very dense areas so that everybody can just
Well,
go
because
hiking
the
and
flip side
kayaking.
of that is they have the aspirational goal of preserving 50% of the land mass in the state.
However, ultimately, we have a lot of young people and even some older people that are having trouble with their living situation, and that needs to be somewhere on our priority list. In my opinion.
I really do, in my mind, theoretically, understand the need for denser housing situations because population is growing. On the other hand, I've seen what happened at the other extreme of this, sort of the Jersey Shore, where, maybe in the 50s, there were all these cute little houses that people came down to the shore and, they had like a 2-bedroom affair, even though they might have had something different in the city, and a little piece of land on each side, and they were quite close to the beach. And then what happened over the years was that those properties were acquired, and the immediate effect was to knock down the house, build something that went out to the edges of the property and up a couple of stories. So you had a mega mansion. And then what happened is each of these mega mansions went up, this little house that remained next door began to look awkward, feel awkward, and whatever, and finally that owner sold and tried to go somewhere else, and then another mega mansion went up. So I guess the extreme is beyond dense, and you didn't get much more in that situation. You didn't get many more people living in the mega mansion. The same 2 people lived there as lived in the little place, but it changed the whole complexion.
Right.
How do we avoid that?
Well, so one of the reasons for creating a separate shoreline, a residential shoreline district, is to ensure, obviously there's strong demand for shoreline property and for living near the water. Always has been and always will be, probably, unless the water comes up really fast, in which case it might suddenly become less desirable. But then I guess another ring of waterfront property would be available. We do seem to be drawn to it. So we want to maintain the character of the shoreline and the fragile environmental piece of it as well. Those are concerns. And so there is language in here that will address building size and scale to some, in those districts a little bit more. There will be some protective language, and there is also from the state around the immediate shoreline area and what can be built there. So I think that conversation continues, and everyone is sensitive to that point, both for the shoreline and for other neighborhoods around the city as well. And well, I think the ideal thing would be that infill happens in these neighborhoods in a way that fits in, right? That utilizes these underutilized spaces. So Frank mentioned the idea of allowing for a back lot that doesn't necessarily have road frontage. So sort of taking advantage of land that's there, and not necessarily tearing buildings down and rebuilding different types of buildings or larger scale buildings. In most places, in most settings in Newport and in most communities across Vermont, there is actually right now that isn't really economically viable. It rarely happens, the tearing it down and then building something else there, acquiring a couple of lots, tearing it all down and rebuilding. It's very hard to make money doing that. Somebody can lose money doing that, but it's really hard to make it. And so it doesn't happen very much. In places where there's real development pressure, which there are a few places, and certainly your waterfront might fall into that category where there could be some real economic value to changing out the structures that are there for something that is of higher value in the market. So those are things that we will pay attention to, but I would say that if you're living in a residential neighborhood in Newport, I would not anticipate that you're going to see a significant demand for suddenly buying homes, tearing them down, and building, a 4-unit building because now you can.
But nothing in the bylaws will prevent that.
It would be possible to accomplish it in the under the rules that you have to there will be requirements and you'd have to meet them, but it would be possible to have that happen. It's just that the bank is going to laugh at you when you go to get the money to do it.
So I didn't hear that last
The
sentence.
bank isn't going to give you the money to do it. That's where the real problem is. It just doesn't. It's not particularly financially viable, which is why we don't really see it happen that much.
Well, sure. We have the issue now where it costs $350,000 to build a 1,400 square foot ranch house with a 2-car garage on a city lot, but it'll only appraise at $250,000, so nobody's doing it because the marketplace just can't support it. The only place where you ever really see any teardowns, and that phenomenon has existed for 30 years, is on the waterfront. Lake Seymour, people have converted seasonal cottages to year-round homes. Memphremagog the same. Anybody who was on the lake in the 60s, either of those lakes can certainly tell you that they're nothing like they were then today, in the sense of the old summer seasonal places are pretty much all gone. And they've been replaced with large homes. And even at that level, where you have people paying cash and money seems to be no object. I mean, a lot of them are losing money on resales for the same reason. That even with the demand, the marketplace simply doesn't support what they have into the place. So,
And that's tended to happen, over time in Vermont, where people come and, I have to be up here and see this beautiful scenery. 3 years later, it's on the market. Well, local people can't afford like an $80 million house, so it just sits there. And so they're just going to lose their money if they do that. because nobody's gonna buy it unless you can get another person that's as rich as you are and likes the same view, you know.
There's a whole real estate market devoted to that.
That's right.
Well, and actually, the real numbers in Vermont in terms of the highest end house that's ever been listed is more like 20 million.
Yeah.
Speak just a little louder.
I said the highest end house that's ever really been listed for Vermont, in Vermont is for sale in Stowe now, and it's around 20 million asking price. So we have a ways to go to get to the Martha's Vineyard type stuff.
Yeah.
But I mean, another example of how incremental it is the whole neighborhood around on the bluffs, the whole Pine Bluff Estates, Estate Drive, Cherry Lane, that neighborhood. That was all zoned and approved in 1985 and 86. And there are still lots available there, and there's still the ability to build a few more condos there, another building or two that have never been built 37, 38 years later. So change certainly doesn't happen overnight.
Other questions on the residential piece? Okay, I've just got a little close up here. So we've obviously covered a lot of territory tonight. There's a lot of information here, and there's more available if you want to go find it. If you have the handouts, there's a website and a code you can scan if you do that sort of thing with your phone. And that will take you to this webpage here, which has maps and is being grumpy with me here. So let's see if we can get it to work. Okay, yes. So I almost brought my mouse because I thought that navigating this thing was going to be a challenge with just my trackpad. I should have brought the mouse. So there's an online map feature where you can actually click on that and you can get a zoomed in map view that compares the current zoning to the proposed one. So you can enter in your address like Google Maps, and it will zoom you into your place, or you can wander around and look at different parts of the city. So you can definitely get more information. You click on it, it'll pop up and tell you what the zoning districts are, current and proposed. Sometimes those little pop-up boxes are a bit grumpy, and you just need to make sure you make them go away by clicking them both. They're supposed to, if you click one of them, they're both supposed to go away, but it doesn't work 100% of the time. So there's that. And then there is a question and comment form, so you can send any specific questions you have or comments on the materials that are there. This is going to be up and available from this point going forward throughout the rest of the project. And those questions and comments will come in to us and then get filtered over to the Planning Commission as well. And so that is a good way to get your opinions and thoughts and concerns in front of the Planning Commission. And then Planning Commission meets twice a month. Their meetings are public meetings, and people are welcome to come and speak to them directly. And your meetings are?
First and third Tuesday.
First and third Tuesdays at
6:30.
6:30. And you can see generally what the topics are going to be that are specific, but usually the first meeting of the month is being devoted to the bylaw.